So I think consistency beats almost everything in podcasting. If you make another one of my phrases, not my phrases, but phrases that I love is the perfect is the enemy of the good, or done beats perfect. I think just get stuff out and make yourself do it and set a cadence and make stuff do it, because that forces you to produce content and it builds an audience that understands it's going to get content from you. So consistency is one. Quality is another. That doesn't have to mean buy an expensive mic or record in a studio. It's just let's not piss off our audience by having tinny, crappy, echoey audio, but also that quality can be about the quality of conversations, the quality of connection as well. There has to be some heart and soul in here as well. And the third one, I'm afraid, is just luck. Genuinely, I think one of the huge things that separates the sheep from the goats in most media outcomes is luck. Now, I'm an enormous believer in luck. However, there's a corollary to that, which is that I believe you can make your own luck to a certain extent. You can put yourself in a position for luck to find you. You can be open to opportunities, open to connections and growth and everything else.
Well, welcome everybody back to the Full Battery Media podcast. I have a repeat guest, but not on this podcast, from one of my other podcasts that came back. Can you tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
So my name is Chris, or Kit. I have been working in publishing my whole career. I'm now 45. I started when I was 20-something. But I've had lots of different jobs over that career. The only thing, as I've been sort of in the process just now of looking for a new permanent position, as I try to synthesize what it is I do, it sounds really wanky, but the only way you can possibly describe a common narrative thread through all the things I've done in my career is as storytelling. I've worked as a writer, journalist, editor-in-chief, producer, exec producer, head of. But the thing that really unifies all those approaches is, finding interesting stories and telling them really well. And to be clear, those stories don't have to be, true crime, exciting. It's, what's the reality of a thing? What's the truth of a thing? Where do we find the humanity in a thing? And how do we articulate that through the best medium possible and in the best way possible?
I was teaching a class for content creators at a university, and everyone came in and they all took the class, and it was a good group of people. And I was like, why are you here? And people were like, I want to become a famous content creator. And I was like, okay, don't they all, But I said, well, what stories are you going to tell? And I had to help people break down the things that were important to them. And I've talked about this before. There was one kid in the class who had a car that he loved, and it was a Subaru WRX. And he talked to me about the car and how, the car was super meaningful to him because there was a family connection and it was something he worked on with a family member. And what stood out to me was that there was a story there, and he was able to do something passionately with it. And I was just for most people, oh, it's just a car. It wasn't just a car. One of the best videos I've ever seen was a video of done. I believe it was sponsored by GoPro. It wasn't sponsored by them, but they edited it. It was this guy, and it was about him riding Royal Enfields on the highest road in India. And so they go, and it beautifully filmed. They ride from this one city all the way to this road that is literally the highest road in the world. And the story talks about how this guy did this because his father had recently passed, and this ride was something that his dad had always wanted to do and never did. And right there, it was just it's just a motorcycle video. No, man, that's a soul-touching narrative about why this everyday journey is so important for someone.
Well, it reminds me of two things. One is, I wrote a tutorial years and years ago when I was writing for a computer magazine about photography, and it was kind of less about the ways it was mostly about how to use a smartphone to take good photographs. So it was the kind of practical bit you want. But I included one section which was on kind of photography as an art form tips as well. And so onanistic to quote myself back to myself. But one of the tips I remember writing that I thought was true then, think is true now, is that through the acts of taking photographs or filmmaking or recording audio or writing a story or whatever, you're making so many choices about the framing of the thing that you're looking at. And the tiny example I gave was if you're taking a picture of a kid, taking that picture of the kid, if you're just like standing there and you hold up your camera and point down at the kid and take the photograph, then you've got a photograph of the kid, sure. But if you get down to their level and you're at their level and you're looking at them, you get a very different photograph and you're telling a very different story about the experience of being a kid. And I think that so often we default to our natural viewpoint, standing up, looking at kid, taking a photograph, but actually there are so many more viewpoints to take. And that's part of the business of telling stories. But I think that business of telling stories is like fundamental to us as a species. There's a really, one of my favorite authors is Terry Pratchett, who wrote the Discworld series. He actually collaborated with Ian Stewart and Jack Cohen on a series of books called The Science of Discworld, which blends real world science and the kind of fantasy magical world of his creation. And in one of those books, they said a thing that really resonated with me, which was to describe humans not as Homo sapiens, not as wise man, but as Pan-Narrans, as the storytelling chimp. And that really, I think, gets to the absolute soul and center of what we are as a species. To call ourselves wise man is hubris in the extreme, but we are storytelling chimps. We sit around and we ook and we show people where the ripe fruit is and we share experiences in the best way we can. But so much of what powers our culture and our identity and everything we are comes down to the power of stories. And those stories sometimes are, yes, Disney. It's what you see on a big screen. But the mere act of talking to somebody over a coffee, even if the semantic content of that conversation is null, even if you're doing the, another day, another dollar, oh yeah, how are you? Oh yeah, weather's a bit shit. Like, even if that's all you're doing, the semantic content is pretty null, you are still telling stories about your relationship with that person, about the context of the situation you're in, all that sort of stuff.
I love that. And I want to come back, touch a couple things right there. First of all, I love the perspective. First off, I watched this one video. I went to buy a drink for my wife the other day, and I was standing so much taller than the two people who were serving me the drink. And I was looking at this perspective of like upward down. And that's sometimes, and when I take photos, it's always from that angle. I'm always at this higher perspective. But I watched this video the other day that someone put it was like a 360 cam on the dog and let the dog just go out and around it. And it was just like so weird to see that world from a different perspective. I remember when I was a kid, my parents worked at this university and it was the biggest place in the world. It was huge. It was a giant college. It was this place that it was just like absolutely enormous. And I went as an adult to visit the place that I grew up. I walked across the campus in like a minute and a half. It was a small college, but to me as a child, it was this huge place. And we have all,
and be able to anticipate those perspectives in others as well, and to think about how the world looks like from their perspective. That's step one. Step two is then to modify behavior, and that's how we combat prejudice, how we combat various phobias. But even just recognizing it is a step that a lot of people don't take, but they should, because not only does that aid our greater humanity, but it's more fun. Like, if you can see the world from somebody else's perspective and try to understand how that looks like.
Last year, probably the most fun thing that I did last year was my wife had a show with our friend Tony. And Tony is probably one of the most amazing musicians I know. Tony also is the drag queen Honey Gluttony. And so at that show, my wife, it was coming up on Women's Day, and we decided that we wanted to make some content. And she was like, because we'll talk. Sometimes I'll go with her to shows and help her, get in and out. And she's like, so you got to slow down. You don't know how hard it is to walk in this heels and in this dress, and she'll do makeup for 2.5 hours, 3 hours sometimes before each show. And so we sat down and I said, what if, and she and I had this idea, what if at this show, go through this transformation and see what it takes for her to get ready at each show. And showed up, and Honey Gluttony had a wonderful makeup artist that helped me. It was a 3.5 hour, like, sitting there, getting all the makeup done, getting into the dress, and it was fun. It was interesting. But then I had to sit there, and it was wild. It was such a wild experience, like walking out. Some of the things that I was really blown away by was just seeing the different perspectives. One is that I was having men stare at my breasts the whole time. And I was like, I'm not that good looking of a woman, but like, you guys are still staring at me, you know? And then the second thing was like, how wonderfully validating all of these ladies were, these women. I was in the elevator and there was this old Vietnamese woman next to me, and she looked up at me, and I was obviously uncomfortable riding this elevator down after getting my makeup done.
Looked up at you at a vertical angle, I'm sure.
Looked up at me in the sweetest little voice. She says, "You look beautiful." And that was it. And then I was just like, what a sweet thing to say. And then I was just blown away by the challenge of, wearing the heels. And like, I was so excited at 4 p.m. We finished my makeup and the show's not till 10. And I just sit there in this makeup for all these hours. But what was powerful was that I got to step into someone's shoes. And I think that one of the beauties, right? And the beauty of being able to like, that's what cinema is. That's what film is being able to step into someone else's shoes. That's what great storytelling is. You can see the world through someone else's, story. You can see it from their perspective.
I think that's interesting as well, because you just
Tiny.
had a tiny taste of that experience there of experiencing what life is like in a different gender. Tons and tons of my friends are trans or non-binary, and I have so many interesting conversations, whether they are AMAB or AFAB, and understanding the experience they have as they transition. Some of them are in a partway along that journey. Some of them are very far along that journey, and the way people react to them is incredibly different. One of my friends is a trans man, and I had a conversation with him about him feeling safe walking around at night, and which is an interesting experience because, of course, as men, we are used to not feeling particularly threatened as we walk around at night. Very different experience for women. This was somebody who was born as a woman or who had lived as a woman for a long time before he transitioned, and yet, and who you wouldn't know for a moment to look at him that he was anything other than cisgender. But if he is having the same experience of feeling nervous while walking around because he thinks people are going to clock him as trans, or he thinks he's going to get unwanted attention, in part, there's that little subroutine running from when he experienced the world as a woman. It makes you realize how difficult the experience is for everybody who's not just assisted to walk around at night.
I'm glad that we were talking about all of this because when I was teaching my content creation class, I told my students that there is power in telling stories. There is power in being able to share this information, especially in a time where misinformation is on the rise and people are using our own ignorance to really hurt us as a collective society. I want to ask you a question. As people are using these stories, using this content to tell stories, what separates someone who can just tell, who just makes content from someone who tells truly great stories and makes an impact?
It's really a simple definition, I think. Stories have intent. Content is just stuff. And sometimes that stuff can have narrative. It can have emergent narrative. It can have unintended narrative, or meta-narrative even, where if you're just like making content without intent, without an intent to tell stories, sometimes those stories will happen without you really noticing it, and maybe the stories you're telling aren't the ones you intend to tell. But I think if you are in the business of storytelling, then you have a mission and a purpose and a vision and an idea of where you want to go and what you want to do and how you want to say it and what it is you want to say and what you want to elicit and how you want to bring people along that journey with you. If you think about storytelling as
Yeah.
an ancient art, right? Our most ancient art of sitting around the campfire and telling stories to each other. The business of the storyteller, the classic vision of the storyteller, in the flickering light of the flames, and everybody sort of sitting around looking up at them, that is somebody who is bringing you along on the journey. And, if we think about our fables that we have as a society, then we are the reason storytelling is important in that context is it's a way of warning us, a way of building identity, and a way of us building that understanding as a culture and a society. I remember when the right started to gain traction in America. I remember, and this was so long ago that I was still posting on Twitter. I remember posting that I love the fact that we have the word demagogue. Right, demagogue is somebody who appeals to the emotions in how they seize political power. And I remember thinking, it's great we have that word, because the very fact that that word exists means that
Yeah.
we know what that person is. We have seen this bastard before and we've named it. And that's the first step in trying, like, naming something is the first step in taking power over something. And it's that same thing with storytelling. If we're telling the same story in different ways, if we're warning people about the big bad wolf, if we're thinking about how we structure and shape the kind of society we want to be, for good and for ill, and that's where you come back into with your point about misinformation, especially the rise of AI generated content just now. Storytelling has unrivaled power because our brains are wired to engage with stories, unrivaled power to change our minds. Like we don't respond particularly well to facts and to
I love
statistics.
that.
We respond to narrative.
The thing that I thinking about with this is that as we create those narratives and now we're sharing those narratives, sometimes one of the things that I found is that I don't always have clarity about what it is that I'm trying to tell or what stories need to be told. And the story sometimes unfolds in front of me, and I simply have to be committed to the art of capturing it, of being present to it. Because whenever I've come in with an idea, this is the story I need to tell. And then I turn the camera on and another story emerges. And I think that there's an honesty. I have a tattoo right here. It's a sword, fire sword. When I was younger, I was living in this town, and these monks came to do these Tibetan Buddhist monks came to do this empowerment. They were going to anoint all these people and bless them with the spirit of the medicine Buddha. And I went to this ceremony because I wanted to be connected to the medicine Buddha. I thought that would be so cool. And so I showed up, and the monks looked at us and they said, in meditation, we were told to do a different attunement. We were told to do the Manjushri Buddha attunement for all of you. And people who don't know, the Manjushri Buddha is the Buddha of truth. It's the embodiment of truth, and that truth can be known, truth can be seen, and truth can be experienced. And not the truth of like, what does the book say, but of lived experience, the truth of what you experience in that breath, if that makes any sense. And I think that we should be dedicated to capturing the truth of what we see in the stories that are unfolding, if that makes any sense. Very esoteric.
It really does. And as soon as you started speaking, I was reminded of one of my guiding principles. I just looked up because I couldn't remember who to attribute the line to, and it turns out you can't attribute it to anybody. It is variously attributed to lots of different people. But the line is, how do I know what I think until I hear what I see? And I think the very act of articulating something is the process by which we gain the understanding of what that thing is. I don't operate by having a view and then articulating it. I operate by articulating unformed thoughts, which are themselves informed by other people. I realized that I've worked in podcasting for a few years now, and there's lots of different ways for that business to be constituted and lots of different ways to make successful podcasts. But I realized that in my own podcast consumption, the thing that unifies all the shows I listen to is that basically, whether it's a comedy show or a history show or whatever, it's people attempting to be better, to better themselves, and not in a sort of pious way, not in a hair shirt way, but just like they're trying to understand. They're hungry for understanding, for growth, and for personal development. Again, I sort of shy away from. I actively dislike the sort of like personal growth mindset of growth hacking and the Brian Johnson stuff of like eternal youth and that stuff. I actively find unpleasant. It shades into bro culture and unpleasant masculinity to me, but getting better about stuff is really important to me. And that's what happens with me. And I will listen to people, smart people saying, and empathetic people and kind people saying things, and then I will consider them and process them. And then as I talk about stuff, I can feel the connections being built. And like if anyone watches me doing little vloggy things on my Instagram, you'll quite often see me starting a thought and then going, "Oh, that's what I think," and then being able to like finish the thought and articulate it. And then, henceforth, I have a
I
thought,
love
I have a
that.
position, I have a perspective.
It's one of the I notice with my own teams and the content we create, there is this tendency for people to chase trends, but the reality is one of the places I feel this the most is with my daughter's YouTube channel. And it's not my daughter, we do it together. We do the content for kids. And I love Ilani's Little World. It's one of my favorite things to do. And we do all types of fun content. But one of the things that my YouTube's algorithm turned on us horribly. It buried our content, especially our reels where we were talking to these people. And my editors were like, well, maybe we should do, or in my content team, maybe we should do more shocking things or exciting things. And I said, we're talking with scientists that are awesome. We are talking to a NASA rocket scientist who shares with kids about how to make rockets. If the algorithm doesn't love us, I don't give a shit. I'm going to keep making videos with NASA scientists. We're going to keep making videos telling kids about cool things with animals, and we're going to keep doing what we do, because at the end of the day, it's not about chasing trends for me. It's about staying true to the voice that we're sharing, and then seeing. I mean, I'm not saying we're not seeing what clicks and we're not seeing what people are engaging with, but yet you have to figure out how to balance that to stay true to your voice while also making content that people want to listen to. How do you think people can kind of find that balance? Because I'm still trying to figure it out.
The balance is the important thing, because I think, especially in a media landscape as we have today, unless you are in the established media milieu, which of course is changing and being transformed in lots of different ways. But if you're a sole content creator or a small studio of content creators, the challenge we have is that the algorithm has become the default. We assume that feeding the algo is the way to get growth, because it
Mm-hmm.
it's a sugar rush. It's, you can put some content up and you can go viral. My God, that phrase! But you can, with little effort on your part beyond making the content, the algorithm can bring people to your content and expose it to them and grow your audience that way. And that's delicious and delightful, and it's really cool when that happens. But I do think you can find a balance, and it will be different for everybody, which is why it's not really a formula, but you can find a balance between, okay, let's do some things that will feed the algo, that will allow it. For example, on YouTube, one of the best
Yeah.
ways of doing that is to use your shorts, because shorts are really good at audience discovery. And in fact, YouTube in general is its biggest strength, as far as I can see it as a content creator, is that it is a vector for surfacing your content to other people more so than anything else. It doesn't exist. That same model doesn't exist in podcasting. One of the big arguments in podcasting about the use of video in podcasting, and one of the reasons to do it, if your show format lends itself to it, is because you can put it on YouTube, and then YouTube can go and find your audiences. But all that said, that's a new thing. The algo's a new thing, and it is a cruel mistress. And we've seen this so often with SEO, with Google's Panda update, delisting people, and we're seeing that big shift now with the use of AI in organic search results. Everyone's scrabbling to stay on top of that wave and not get drowned by it, and that's fine. And do you know what? I think if you don't respect the power of the algorithm, the opportunities of the algorithm, and you don't do any work to stay on top of the opportunities and the challenges it presents to you, you're an idiot, frankly. However, I think much more important than that is just, setting your North Star, setting your sails, and chasing the thing that feels true and right to you. And that's partly because I think that is the right thing to do strategically, because you're producing high quality content and actually organically building a core audience that really loves you for the things you do is the single most important thing you can do to build resilience for your output. but it's also just the right thing to do morally. Like, as a human being, just focus on making something excellent.
It leads this because, like, coming back to the growth, because if someone's going out and wanting to have stories that are impactful and get out there, you do have to grow. And like, where do you think people should put their attention? Should it be the message, their format, or the platform they post on?
I think it's format. Now, I would say that because that's kind of the thing I do most of the time in my day job as a creative director across different media formats. But I think it's format, and it's format because it does two things for you. Number one, it forces you to articulate the thing that is special about your offering. If you work out a format for the thing, you're being forced to think about, medium, cadence, duration, editorial franchises, sponsorship opportunities, all that sort of stuff. So that's one reason. But the other reason is it just makes it easier. It just makes it easier. If you've got a shape of a container for every single episode of the thing you do, or even if you're not thinking episodically, like I have a little channel about e-bikes, and this is specifically designed. I started it for two reasons. One, because I'm 45 years old, I should know how TikTok works, but also because I wanted to produce something that was like not beholden to anybody or anything or any trends or anything. I just wanted to like make some fun content just for me. But that's not episodic. I just like record every now and then. And, YouTube hates that. YouTube doesn't like my channel because even though it's about one subject, which YouTube does like, it doesn't like the fact that there's no regularity or cadence to what I produce, but I don't care. But if you have the shape of a container into which you can pour your content, it just means that every episode, every time you hit record, every time you put pen to paper, every time you sit down at your word processor, you're just pouring content into that container time and time again on a predictable shape. And that makes it easier for you, but it also means that your audience can get a sense of what they're going to get. And, that might be as rigid as, we ask the same three questions of every interviewee. Like one of my favorite shows is Off Menu with James Gamble and James Acaster, where they just ask everybody's favorite starter, main course, dessert, side dish, and drink, and they talk about it. Sounds quite dull. It's incredibly funny because they're incredibly charismatic and very funny. But there's a very precise format there of just asking these X questions. It doesn't have to be quite as precise as that, but as long as you kind of know where you're starting and know where you're ending, then you can play about in the middle. So yeah, I think format is the thing to get right at the start, because that will make your job easier and it'll make your content stronger, and then you can start thinking about promotion.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons that for me, the format that was most straightforward that I gravitated towards was podcasts. And because I just love conversations. I love talking to people. And I love the ability of a conversation to explore topics that you might not be able to get through yourself, that you might need someone else's perspective to help you broaden your mind to a degree. But that's why I think why people come to podcasts. You listen so that you can sit there and go, now I know my perspectives, and now I've got this other person who's sharing this idea, and I'm challenged. I am being forced to question what I believe and what I think. And that being challenged is one of the reasons that I think podcasts have become such a strong tool for storytelling, because how challenged can you be with a short form video? I'm sure you can. I'm sure that there are people that are really good at it. But when you hear a conversation and you hear someone whose perspective is very different from yours, it forces you to ask questions that are hard. Wow, I didn't know that this person, insert whatever that category is that you were had a judgment about, has a very different perspective, or this topic that they're talking about has a very different perspective. It's powerful like that.
It is, and I think the things that podcasting do particularly well is consistency. It's quality. It's not necessarily technical quality, although there is a bar you should probably hit so you're not like making it actively unpleasant for your audience to listen to. But it's that intimacy, that connection, that depth of engagement that you can have. One of the incredible opportunities that podcasting gives everybody, whether they're a business or a bedroom podcaster, is the opportunity to ask politely and deferentially for time. Like you don't get, if you in the business of podcasting, if I'm doing commercial podcasting, we are constantly challenged, the numbers are low, which they are. if you're comparing it against the reach you get for short form video or for CPM ads on Google or whatever, the audience numbers are very low, but the engagement is through the roof. And if you imagine like putting, let's say, 150 people, if that's what your podcast gets per week to listen, 150 people in a room and they sit and they listen wrapped to you for an hour, that's nuts. And that ability to, one of my lines about podcasting is that we're in a unique position to be the part of somebody's day where if they're leaving the house in the morning, they're not thinking, oh shit, I've got to spend an hour and a half pressed up against somebody's sweaty armpit on the tube. They think, finally, this is my chance to listen to the latest episode of this show that I love, that feels like me, that connects me, that expands me, that helps me grow. And it takes a lot of work to get to earn that trust. But once you have got an unprecedented opportunity to sit somebody down and go, like, I noticed myself, one of shows I've kind of stopped listening to it now, but that was in my rotation for a very long time, was a very old BBC show called Desert Island Discs, where a celebrity is brought on, they get asked their music they would take to Desert Island, and they talk about it. And I noticed something in my behavior, which is that once I started listening to that in a podcast rather than as a radio broadcast, I would scroll through the list, I would pick the people that I knew, I'd listen to them, and that was great. But actually, if I then exhausted that list and I had to listen to people whose names I didn't know, I actually often had a much better time. And that's the power of being able to say to somebody, look, I know that this is a bit of a tough ask. Like, you don't, like, your audience listening to this episode right now almost certainly have got no idea who I am. But because you built up the trust where you've said, hey, I'm going to curate some interesting conversations for you, you're going to have to trust me that they're going to be good, your audience has given you, so far, about half an hour of their time to sit down and listen to this conversation. And
I had a great email today, or message on LinkedIn, and it was someone who added me. And he said, hey, and he was really well connected to some people that I was very surprised that I was getting this message. And he said, Sean, I wanted to add you on LinkedIn because I'm trying to reach out to media leaders in the personal finance industry. And I was like, Jesus Christ, man, I'm like, first of all, I started a podcast about personal finance because I know jack shit about personal finance. I am sorry. I know nothing about personal finance. I started it because I was so overwhelmed with all of the stuff that I was seeing in the personal finance space. And I was just going, no one's speaking to people like me. It's like they're talking to people. I had a guest yesterday on my Barrels and Roots podcast that she's like, we inherited some money and we inherited a portfolio. And she's like, and there was someone managing it. And like after he passed it, after we received it, she was like, and he kept managing it. Like, she's like, I'm not the type of person who can have a financial planner. And I was like, hold on, everyone should be able to have someone that can help them with their money. Like, that's one of the things. So I started this podcast but I didn't know that when I started the podcast. I started the podcast to talk to people so I could learn things about money. And then 100 some odd episodes deep, I've talked to some of the biggest thought leaders in the field. Now, here's the thing. When I got that message, it wasn't like any type of inflation to my ego. It was just this, well, shit. If I have access and someone thinks of me as a thought leader, maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can start getting people to change the conversations that are being had. Because right now, they're not helping the people that need to be helped. We're not getting, the information out that needs to get out about how to help people be, one of the biggest things out there. I was reading this, I was having a guest talk to me, and he was quoting a study that said one of the biggest things that causes anxiety for people is personal finance, or financial stress. And I was thinking, if we could get people this information to help figure out how to get your finances in order, I'm not talking getting billions of dollars. I'm talking that you have a simple plan so you're not living paycheck to paycheck, and that you have an emergency fund, and that you're not in crazy credit card debt or student loan debt. If you can have some of those basic tools and we can eliminate some of that stress, isn't that a powerful thing? And I'm one guy who just started a podcast because my 8-year-old daughter at that time was saying, Daddy, tell me about money. And I was like, shit, I don't know. But yet now I have people messaging me because they say I'm a media leader in the personal finance industry, and I still think that's crazy. But dude, if I can lead in on that and make a difference, but the thing today is like I don't think that people realize that if you start something right now and you lean in on it and you stick with it, you could be a leader in the field because we're entering a whole new era of media, and with podcasting, the sky's the limit. Like the barrier to entry is very low, and it's very saturated now. But like, dude, I stuck with this stuff because it was important to me because I really wanted to figure out things so I can put my family in a better place. And like that journey of self-discovery has been the fuel. So I love podcasting for that, and I love the ability to make a difference.
I think that connection is so important. It's the parasocial connection thing as well. Like, we can connect ourselves to, the downside of the interconnectedness of the world these days is that, our brains literally are not designed to deal with this much bad news, these many connections. If your listeners don't know about Dunbar's number, they should look it up. Basically, the idea that there's a putative maximum number of connections that we can maintain as human beings. I think it's about 150.
Yeah.
Because that's, we are Pan-Narrans, we're storytelling chimps. Like, we're not that evolved from monkeys, to be frank. And there is some hardwiring in our brains that, the firmware was only built to deal with this many things, this many people, but we can. But so that's the downside, is that we're suddenly exposed to this avalanche of difficult news and horror that we can't really engage with. And yet, the flip of that can be something so joyous. I remember I saw a meme a few years ago that was just like, "You're addicted to your phone." No, I'm addicted to my friends. It's just that they happen to live in my phone. It's really true. Like, so, like, if you see me just like sort of like scrolling my phone or typing on my phone, it's easy to think, oh, just doom scrolling or whatever. But like I spend a lot of time with my friends IRL, but I also spend a lot of time with my friends in like group chats or like sending stupid memes or whatever. It's like those connections that we have, those parasocial.
Yeah.
Actually, those aren't quite parasocial, but like your audience, Sean, on this show has a parasocial relationship with you, and they see you as a friend, they trust you to an extent that has come from earning that, and that connection is hard to build. It takes time and it takes effort, and it will be a very slow burn. Let's come back to the point about the algorithm. The algorithms are good, or paid media as well, is the sugar rush that will get you some vanity numbers and it will get you exposed in lots of different ways. But for example, like in podcasting in particular, a lot of the narrative just now is like, oh, even if your show isn't going to be a video show, you should still record videos so you can put out clips on Reels or TikTok or Shorts, which is a fair point, and it's true. But also, those things don't tend to translate into audience on your podcast. However, I do think it's still worth doing, because even though you won't see a clip of me talking to you on this show on Insta Reels and then immediately come and subscribe to your podcast, having been exposed to that reel through a choice the algorithm made, if you see different guests on your show coming up and somebody's served that 6 or 7 times, they might just go, Sean Trace guy's got some stuff to say, and might then go and seek you out.
I had a gentleman, Chimp, that I invited onto my financial podcast, and he said, literal words, "I don't know who you are, but you're having conversations with people I like and respect, and I've enjoyed the conversations. And I thought, I want to have a conversation with you as well." And I was like, and that right there is the power that I feel comes through the ability to build these relationships in this content. And one of the things that it leads a question that when I have clients that are trying to build podcasts with me, and they're starting a podcast, and they look at me and they go, "What makes the difference between a show that grows and one that stays small?" And I don't always know. But one of the things that I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think it's about authenticity. And I know that word is used a lot, but I think that you have to be authentic and actually care. I'm not going to have a podcast about Arabian horses because I don't know a damn thing about Arabian horses except for when I was a kid, my uncle had a farm. Now, does that mean I can't learn? I mean, I did the same thing with personal finance. I started a podcast I knew nothing about, so maybe I could. but it's not something I'm passionate about. And I would just feel very awkward doing that. I was hosting a podcast for my old university, and they were really lovely people. I loved everyone I talked to, but I just didn't feel as authentic because I'm not a big fan of student loans. And like, if I'm doing this podcast, people go to that school through student loans. And it just didn't, at the end of the day, it wasn't something I wanted to be putting my energy into just because it wasn't something I felt authentic about. But what makes the difference between a show that grows and one that stays small?
I mentioned it earlier a little bit. So I think there are three things. If we take authenticity as a given, those three things are consistency. Consistency beats almost everything in podcasting in particular, but in a lot of things as well. We hear a lot about pod fade, this thing that you'll do. Like, you'll excitedly put out your first episode, and then your second episode, then your third episode will be 3 days late, your fourth episode will come out a
Yeah.
month after it's supposed to, and then you just kind of stop. And that's fair, because apart from anything else, a lot of people don't realize the amount of work that comes after you press the stop recording button on a podcast, not just in terms of editing the show itself, but in terms of the publishing, the promotion, etc., etc. But also, so I think consistency beats almost everything in podcasting. If you make another one of my phrases, not my phrases, but phrases that I love, is the perfect is the enemy of the good, or done beats perfect. I think just get stuff out and make yourself do it, and set a cadence and make stuff do it, because that forces you to produce content, and it builds an audience that understands it's going to get content from you. So consistency is one. Quality is another. That doesn't have to mean like, buy an expensive mic or record in a studio. It's just like, let's not piss off our audience by having tinny, crappy, echoey audio, but also that quality can be about the quality of conversations, the quality of connection as well. Like, there has to be like
Yeah.
some heart and soul in here as well. And the third one, I'm afraid, is just luck. Genuinely, I think one of the huge things that separates the sheep from the goats in most media outcomes is luck. Now, I'm an enormous believer in luck. However, there's a corollary to that, which is that I believe you can make your own luck to a certain extent. You can put yourself in a position for luck to find you. You can be open to opportunities, open to connections and growth and everything else. But I get pissed off a lot when I hear, because we hear like endless like success stories shared in podcasting or in other media channels. How did it's the Stephen Bartlett effect, Diary of a CEO. It's like, how did you get to what grit and determination did you show? What sacrifices did you make? How did you push through to be where you are today? That's all grand. But the survivor bias is through the roof. Like, we only hear from people who have made it. We don't hear, there's the famous image of the plane covered in little red dots showing damage that was gathered on planes coming back from recce's in, I think, World War II. And we see, the Department of War had done this incredibly important piece of data analysis where they mapped all the gunshots that had happened, and then they're like, okay, so if they're being hit here, then we could like armor this part or armor that part, and that will give them a better but the big thing, of course, is that they're not measuring the planes that didn't come back. So actually, the data you're seeing is bad data, because it's showing you the things that are survivable, not the things that kill you. And there's so much. And so my point here about luck is, I can sit here and say, create opportunities for luck to find you. Build connections, trust that good things will happen.
Yeah.
You might still end up crashing. You might not make it. You might burn through life savings. You might have an awful experience. And it's really important that we don't just chase success or lionize success for its own sake.
I recently had a friend and a person who was an advisor for myself that spent 16,000 plus on a series of videos to support his business. 16,000 US. And then his business went under, and that was a painful expense that he thought this content was going to be the thing. The content was going to blow up. And one of the things that I tell people is, I have a team that works with me, and I have multiple editors, a whole content team that I built, that I do client for work as well as my own work. And it is still exhausting for me. And I have been doing this for years, and I am just now starting to get traction. the people do not realize the amount of work it takes, the amount of stress it takes, and like for Ilani's little world, the amount of money I dropped into Ilani's little world is a lot to get all these videos done, to do everything. But I keep it up for Ilani's little world, especially because my daughter gets to learn some things. First of all, I'm paying for her to have these opportunities to speak to these awesome scientists, to have these people validate her as a young creative mind. And she gets to work. I let her do some of her own slides after we make things. She gets to sit there and help with the story. So I'm teaching her about that responsibility. But if I were looking on ROI, like financially, it's low. And I mean, I used to be like, well, maybe we could be like big like Mr. Beast. Man, Mr. Beast is an outlier. He is a massive, massive, massive outlier. And if you think otherwise, you are very, very mistaken.
But also, I think we have poor statistical articulacy and literacy as a society, and for that reason, if somebody tells you the average of anything, you should immediately your first question should be, well, do you mean median, mode, or mean? Like, because there are so many ways of taking it. Not so many ways of taking average. There's 3 that I know of. There may be more. Again, poor statistical literacy. But the point is that taking the median of something is usually so much more illuminative of the actual takeaways you should take from something than taking the mean from something. Because you're right. So in podcasting, one of the stats, if you look on Blueberry publishes their stats, and so I think it's currently something like 49 downloads is the mean number of downloads a podcast will get in its first 7 days. So you can argue that if you get 50 downloads in your first 7 days of your podcast, you're doing better than 50% of all podcasts worldwide. Now, that fact is true, but it masks a lie, which is that number is, yes, being massively skewed on the high end of very successful podcasts, but is being more skewed in the low end of people who start a podcast on Anchor or Spotify for Creators nowadays and do 1 or 2 podcasts and then stop. It's just them pissing about with their friends. The data pulls in both directions. But it's your point about Mr. Beast. It's so far out of the norm.
Let me ask you one last question. Looking ahead, how do you see storytelling and podcasting changing for creators who want to stay ahead of the curve?
Well, it actually comes back to what I think we've spoken about already. And maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe I'm naive. And I'm not being sort of coy or self-deprecating when I say that. Genuinely, maybe I'm an idiot and maybe I'm naive when I say this. But I think that focusing on quality, slow growth, authenticity of connection is the way that we'll get through what's coming. Because what's coming is not just pressures of commercialization, siloization, people try to slice the pie up in different ways and take more pie for themselves, and the sometimes corrosive power of algorithmic feeds. It's not just all that, because we had all that, and that was still enough of a challenge as it was. But we've also now got the rise of AI-generated content, both in the sense of generating content at massive scale that was not possible before, but also the opportunity for that content to be manipulative and manipulated. We have moved on so quickly as a society from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and I think we have not begun to see that was basically influencing voting by hyper serving ads to very specific people, to very targeted ads that nobody else could see but them. And if we imagine that, but with AI generated content, which appears to be legit, being served individually to people, the potential for that to radically disrupt our society, we haven't even begun, I think, to engage with, or most people haven't at least. So we have so much pressure from AI slop, but also from the commercial pressures on storytelling, that I think that even though, as we've said, it might not work. You might not be able to build an audience quickly enough or resiliently enough or big enough in order to monetize them. But I think focusing on intentional storytelling is the way that you navigate your way through that. One of the questions you had been going to ask me, I know, was about commercialization and about making money from a channel. And I think that so often creatives in particular, they outsource the thought of commercialization. Often that's to ads. We'll just run ads, they think, not realizing that you need to be at massive scale for the CPMs advertising to make you any sort of money. But actually, I think, and I've seen, there are so many opportunities for generating revenue on an incredibly small scale. If you build a podcast for your local community that is just, news from your community, and you get 2,000 listeners and that's it. But that's actually a huge audience for the butcher on your high street to advertise their Valentine's Day special to. And you could make $500
Right.
by running an ad for them or doing a sponsor content section with them. And I think thinking in those artisanal, low food mile kind of ways, thinking about how, and that's an example, but hopefully you can extrapolate from there, thinking about what's the audience you're going to build? Who are they, but also what services can you reasonably and morally sell to them?
I love that. And I think that everyone wants to be the next big, Mr. Beast. But one of the podcasts that I'm loving that actually am getting a lot of traction in a very interesting way is my Barrels and Roots podcast that I just started. And I started about 4 months ago, and it's all about wine. And I grew up in wine country in the Napa Valley. And, I absolutely love the industry and I love the people who make wine. And I don't actually drink much, but I loved the art. I love going outside in the middle of Crush and smelling the whole area smell like a wine bottle. It's just unreal. And I wish that people could understand and love that as much as I do. So I started that, right? Well, there's not many people doing that. And it's a very niche podcast. And yet I've been able to speak to people that are absolute pillars of the industry. And it was interesting for me because people in that industry are like, wow, this is such a cool thing. I know you, you're Sean, you're that guy. And I was just like, it's really interesting that you don't have to do a lot to make an impact. You don't have to to get out that much to be seen. And then it's your choice where you want to go with that. But, I think for monetizing, I think one of the things that's important too for people to realize is that you must build trust first. I know Gary Vaynerchuk, there was a great book that came out in the early ages of social media. It was called Trust Agents. Still one of the best books I've read on social media, marketing and content marketing. And these guys are like, you know what? If you want to sell to people, you have to find a way to get them to trust you. And that means in the beginning that you're not selling. You are giving them content and giving them information to build up that trust. And then once you have it, being very, very intentional about what you sell. This is something my wife and I talk about all the time because we've had brands. My wife is a famous singer and she has had brands come to her and they go, "Hey, would you sell this product? It's this, this beauty injection." And she's like, "But I don't do injections myself. Why would I want to sell that?" And not that we have anything against it, because if someone wants to go do that and that's their journey, great, but that's not her journey. And she's very intentional about what she wants to sell because she knows if she goes and sells something that goes against her brand, her image, and her beliefs, she'll lose the trust and you can't get it back.
Yeah. And I think talking about the intentionality of selling is really true as well. It can be subtle, and especially if we're operating in podcasting at the high-end corporate level, I've worked with clients in the past who make some very complex, expensive, but rarely bought, buying cycles of 5 years or more platforms for things. And when they know that if they go out there trying to basically make a webinar about how great the product is, nobody's going to listen to it. You've got to give somebody a reason for do think about that person walking out the front door and shutting it in the morning, and what can you do to be the thing that makes them think, "Thank God, finally 45 minutes of my own, I wanna listen to a recent episode of my favorite show," put their earphones in, spend time with you, and if you are frankly making white paper content in a podcast form, you're doing it entirely wrong, my friend. You need to be thinking first, like, why would anybody give a shit? Why would anybody give me their time, their attention, their trust? And then maybe if you're a very good boy, you get the chance to move them onto a more commercial footing at some point. But, you know, podcasting, content marketing is not for direct sales. It's not. You have other channels for that. This is an opportunity to build those trust and connections, to demonstrate thought leadership, but also to make yourself useful.
Where can people find out more about you and what you offer and what you do?
Easiest thing is at my website, which is chrisphin.com, CHRISPHIN.com, or indeed find me, Chris Phin, on Instagram. I'm also on Mastodon with the same name.